Okay, thank you. That was entertaining, actually. Uh, uh, Good to see you, David, as well. Appreciate you could join. I'll just start with a very quick set of remarks, and just to set the context, although I think uh, we don't need the context setting, but I'll still go ahead and make a few comments. So first of all, DPI is very topical. It's not a surprising thing that the summit this year is focusing on DPI and AI. And a lot of credit, and we've been saying this again and again, goes to India's G20 presidency for bringing DPI discussions to the forefront and making it a priority for LMICs. As Nandan mentioned yesterday, I believe, where we are no more discussing the why of DPI, uh, we want to understand more of the how at this point of time. The critical aspect now is how are governments, markets, and communities going to come together to digitally transform societies and economies. And I should advertise for my dear friend Koshi, who goes next after this panel discussion, because I think ONDC is a good example of that. As we collectively work on implementing DPI, we also need to be mindful about addressing the market failures, especially the digital divide that we see in many countries. We also need to build a safe and inclusive digital public infrastructure to address some of these gaps. And finally, I hope we can cover today the need for global financing community and countries to come together and invest in the DPA implementation. With this, I would turn to my panelists here, and I'll start with Mr. Sushil Pal, if you don't mind. I'll start with you. On 22nd November, the Honorable Prime Minister of India announced the establishment of a social impact fund during the virtual G20 Leaders Summit. I believe this fund aims to employ a multi-stakeholder strategy to accelerate the implementation of DPI in the Global South. My question to you is, what prompted the Indian government to set up this fund?
Thank you, Suhail. First of all, it was our presidency, but the credit, let me reiterate, would go to all the countries, which, and to all the other stakeholders as well, who contributed to such a frank and frank conversation and understanding as to what a DPI could be. I think during one of these Carnegie event a few months back, we were just at the stage of defining as to what DPI is. Very happy that, now from what to how, why and all that, I think now that every country is convinced that, DPI is the approach to take for digitization in the government. If the country's digital economy has to leapfrog, not only for delivering services by the government, but also if the country has to achieve digital inclusion as such, not only financial inclusion. So on that note, I think our Honorable Prime Minister, during the virtual G20 summit, announced the creation of a social impact fund, wherein India contributed to this $35 million and asked other countries to join. I think what made us choose this deliverable, because this was one of our deliverable in the digital economy working group. What made us choose this deliverable was our belief in our belief that the DPI's approach can actually leapfrog the digital transformation in many countries, and many countries are actually not aware about as to what DPI is. There was not so much of understanding among the countries as to what a DPI would constitute. Still, I think we see a lot of confusion as to what would be a DPI and what would not be a DPI. So it was our belief in the DPI approach, and which is actually a totally principle-based approach, wherein government should actually just put down the guardrails and let the private sector innovate and build solutions, not only what you anticipate, but build solutions for the problem which we're not even aware of. So it was with this belief that we chose this agenda, and definitely I think the first agenda was creating the conceptual framework, which was the first one. Second was for the discoverability of the DPI, we chose this second deliverable for the GDPIR. And third was as to, how do we do it? If we have to do this, if we have to implement DPI in the global south or the LMICs, then how do we do it? It obviously would require resources. There were many organizations, many of the international organizations and other agencies, which were implementing DPI in some, but the focus was largely on ID only. Although people kept talking about financial inclusion, but that financial inclusion was only as one of the use cases of ID rather than finance DPI as such. So. Uh, so we where was I? Just yeah. So creation of the fund, yeah. So and we also noted that many a time, many countries were actually not very clear as to which donor to engage with. That was another major point many of the countries were facing, and because India was being approached by many countries as to they were reaching out to us for any kind of a cooperation or for implementing the DPIs in their country. Other was the sustainability aspect. I mean, not all the donors had so much, because this definitely required money. The upstream part and the downstream part of financing it requires sizable amount of money, and the sustainability of the fund was another important point, because in a few countries, I think it did not go forward. I think so. Sustained funding for the DPI implementation was an important factor, and also many a times the countries were not offered the bouquet of services. I mean, they were only offered one DPI by a particular donor. That was another reason we thought that, with a very small incremental funding, you can actually offer an incremental technical assistance. You can offer them a bouquet of DPIs rather than only one DPI. So these were a couple of bottlenecks which we saw in the present ecosystem for deploying these. And with that intent in mind, we had chosen this as one of the deliverable. And although it was termed as a pool financing mechanism, it is still a pool financing mechanism. Thankful to the countries that they engaged heavily into the discussion on. We did a lot of engagement with us, like-minded countries, with the UNDP and the BCG, and with the World Bank, and it was a useful conversation. We did not get an agreement on it, but thankful to the countries that they agreed that this should figure up in the declaration in some form. And we realized that India will have to take lead and move forward, and wait for other countries to join hands as we move on. Thank you.
No, thank you. Really appreciate, and it's been a great start. I've been a witness to the efforts that you referred to, and I also appreciate you acknowledging all the other G20 member countries and organizations that played a critical role. I'm still trying to work on my management of hybrid meetings well. So I'll move to David, just so that we don't lose him. So an important contribution of Germany towards the global agenda for digital public infrastructure has been the GovStack initiative, where GIZ has prepared an assessment framework to assess whether governments are ready for digitization of services or not. My question to you is, what has been the experience of this initiative globally? And just linking to it, how do we ensure good governance of DPI so that it purports inclusion and competition and the safeguards which are required?
Thank you, Sushil, Your Excellency, Mr. Bal, your partners, colleagues. First of all, congratulations, Carnegie Gates Foundation, Métis, all involved for convening this GTS. Definitely one of the most exciting digital policy gatherings in the world. I had really hoped to join you in person, but unfortunately the winter weather conditions over here prevented me from doing so. So sorry for being now on a probably terribly big screen. Let me start with saying 2 years ago, I think only a bunch of people used the term DPI really, and also thanks to India's G20 leadership, the global terminology has advanced and put into practice, for instance, with the DPI repository. From our perspective, all governments in the world face common challenges when it comes to online public service delivery and have to deal with issues related to registration, identification, cash transfer, and data exchange. This is why I would argue DPI is equally relevant for all countries, but especially for development in the global south. While some countries may have the resources to reinvent the wheel over and over again, others, especially LMICs, should avoid the duplication. Brings me to my first point regarding your question. We think capacity development is critical as we see a tremendous demand for DPI in partner countries. In our technical assistance, capacity development is one of the key components, and flexibility is important to meet diverse needs of countries. It is usually often said that governance, not technology, is the problem. From our experience, we believe it's both. You mentioned GovStack, the multi-stakeholder initiative founded by Germany, Estonia, IT, and DIAL, is developing open and interoperable specifications for building blocks, including ID, payments, data exchange, as well as human-centered standards, data protection, privacy by design, and security. The idea is pretty simply that countries and administrations can use these specifications rather than having to reinvent them each for themselves. The bigger vision, of course, is that if these specifications once get adopted widely, we will achieve a de facto standard around them, which mitigates the problem of product and vendor lock-in, makes, just as Mr. Paul said, products cheaper through competition with the private sector, and promotes interoperability. At the moment, GovStack operates with 15 countries and over 130 international experts, but to achieve adoption at scale, we need closer partnerships. My second point would be joint learning and policy dialogues are key. It would be a very big mistake from my point of view that we don't learn from each other through cooperation and peer exchange. See, in Germany, where I could not get my flight, we have not one DPI. I would argue we have around 10,000 in each municipality on state and federal level. And this is something we see in the collaboration with partner governments too. Almost all are actively working on their DPI, but none has no legacy or is sitting on pure green fields. It's probably in the DNA of administration and bureaucracy to do things according to their competencies, responsibilities, and annual budgets. And that almost naturally leads to fragmentation and silos. So fostering a whole of government and society approach requires political will and sponsorship on top level, as well as the right change makers in the administrations. Here we experience how helpful it can be for governments to be part of an international alliance. See the DIO exchanging with the Indian and the Estonian in support to bring good practice around DPI governance into domestic discussions. And this would bring me to my third point of good governance of DPI. For GIZ and German Development Corporation, this is an absolute priority, as we believe that there are also significant risks that DPI can be misused. We think that multilateral development banks can play a key role to ensure good governance of DPI. MDBs like the World Bank are engaged in policy dialogue across sectors, and they can link their large-scale financing for digital transformation to ensuring countries have the adequate policies and regulations in place. And also the UN Tech Envoys and UNDP Safeguards Initiative is important to mention here, and we intend to support with stakeholder consultations. Of course, also the Digital Public Goods Alliance and the 15.5 Advocacy Domain are important to support the supply side of the DPI ecosystem. But again, good governance is of course not only about the right rules and regulations, but it's about capacity building. And this is where organizations like GIZ and UNDP can contribute with our long-term country presence. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm again really sorry you could not make it in person, but it actually gives us a good segue to a question that I have for Kevin. Because this is another potential climate change impact that we are seeing all over. So with the transition in climate strategy, the Rockefeller Foundation is actively investing in advancing the global climate transition part of it. To achieve the climate goal, it is also forging partnerships with other institutions, as I understand. For example, in partnership with the World Resources Institute, or WRI, the Rockefeller Foundation is building the next generation of digital products that can drive climate action. How do you envision the use of the DPI framework in achieving climate solutions?
Great. Well, first of all, it's really exciting to be here in person. Sorry, David, at GTS. And it's amazing to be part of a conversation that has accelerated so much over the past year, thanks to the people in this room. So when I went to our climate people to talk about how DPI can advance climate goals, their first reaction was skeptical. This is the DPI fanatic. He's got a hammer. He's looking for nails. Many of you might have had similar reactions from folks in climate, et cetera. But then we started talking examples, and the conversation changed very, very quickly. Let me walk you through one of those examples. Many of you are probably familiar with the women's cooperative Sewa here in India. Their members oftentimes are doing day labor, piece rate labor, et cetera. They are extremely vulnerable to heat stress and extreme heat. It can mean kidney damage, miscarriage, worse. And many of these women cannot afford to take a day off work just because it's hot. So how did Sewa use DPI to respond to this challenge? They partnered with Blue Planet and a grantee of ours, the Ars Rock Resilience Center, develop an insurance product. It pays out automatically a day's wage when a high heat day is predicted, allowing women to make the choice to stay home, stay in the shade, stay cool as best they are able, and save their health. So what's the role of DPI in this? First of all, the fact that it made it much easier to test it and implement it in the first place. Sewa didn't have to think about payments because India has a payments layer. It also means that if this is successful, Sewa can think about scaling it to their 2.5 million members, to all of India, and then any country, any population that has these layers can think about adopting the same innovation. So this is a way to massively think about scaling both climate responses to climate that are averting suffering now and are also thinking about averting emissions in the future. I can list many other examples ranging from paying farmers to conserve biodiversity to sending out cash transfers ahead of an emergency rather than after it. But what's really exciting is through efforts like the Social Impact Fund, like Co-Develop, the number of countries, the number of places that are going to have access to these solutions and be able to scale them is growing. And we're also, not only are we growing the existing stack in places and making sure that it exists places, but through collaborations like with Kazam and her team at UNDP, they're thinking about what are additional layers of the stack that are climate specific, like digital carbon registries, and adding to the capabilities. So I think we all also have an obligation to start telling the story of this impact. Climate requires societal level solutions that stretch across every sector. DPI is one of the few tools that we have that is also societal level and stretches across every sector. Let's use it.
Really good point, Kevin. And I completely agree. I think a lot of times we don't realize the application piece of DPI in different contexts, and climate is one such example. So it's good that you call that out. One of the challenges that I continue to see when I speak to various people working in the space is about principles. And Sabine, I want to come to you on this one, because as USAID, you've been emphasizing on what are the key principles for digital development for a long time now. And in absence of this global framework for digital public infrastructure, how do these umbrella principles affect the uptake of concept of digital development by different governments itself, and completely in the contextual understanding that they'll have for digital government and their own strategies?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here today. And it's really great to be on this panel and in this room with so many folks that we've worked with throughout the last year on the DPI agenda. And again, just echoing what Kevin said, that it has just grown so significantly over the last year and a half. And thank you for asking me this question. So for over a decade now, USAID has been emphasizing the principles for digital development. They're not USAID's principles. This is a set of 9 best practices that was developed through a multi-stakeholder process. And it's really about integrating best practices into the deployment of technologies. So USAID helped draft the principles for digital development, and we were the first to endorse. But today the principles are endorsed by over 300 organizations. I'm guessing many of the organizations here in this room, public sector, private sector, donors, multilaterals have all endorsed the principles. And additionally, like the principles are a key component of USAID's digital strategy. When we wrote the digital strategy in 2020, we emphasized the principles because we believe all technology projects that USAID does, all digital solutions that we develop for all sectors, should be using these principles when they're being developed, or should at least be consulting the principles. So I think they're all very applicable, or many of them are very applicable to DPIs today. So I'll just give a couple of examples. So we have 2 principles: design with the user and understand the existing ecosystem. This is very straightforward in the development and deployment of DPIs. We've discussed a lot in many of these forums. These are not copy and paste or cut and paste solutions. They have to be developed in a local context. You need to understand the end users. You need to understand the local ecosystem. And so they are very much aligned with these principles for digital development. Another principle is address privacy and security. Again, very, very clear application to the deployment and development of DPIs. One of the biggest concerns that we hear about this technology is what does it mean for privacy and security of individuals and their data. So that has to be a key component of the development of any of these systems. And just one more example is build for sustainability, which I think is really key when we think about the development of these programs or the development of these technologies. We really want to make sure that these are forward-looking, forward-leaning, that we're really thinking about how can we maximize the long-term impact of these solutions and of these technologies. We're not just building for today. We're taking into account population growth. We're taking into account changes in the ecosystem. We're taking into account different use cases. So really building for these to be long-term, enduring solutions. So those are just 4 examples of the 9 principles. But in general, I
Recording in progress.
Everybody take a look at them, and in developing, whether it's a DPI or your own digital solution, again, I think these are just good best practices that everybody should be using in this space. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And I'm going to move to Dushni, you now, because we've not touched a critical topic here, which is this global north-south divide that we tend to refer to many times. In your view, to what extent does this divide contribute to concerns regarding the governance of DPIs? And as an economist from the global south, what, according to you, should the approach to cooperate concerns is in the region and potential global framework for the streamlined adoption of DPIs?
Thank you, Suhail. I'm going to try and answer that from the perspective of my background in involvement in the policy landscape in Sri Lanka and conversations we have on how to incorporate technology. Now, I think one message that's come out today in this panel as well as yesterday repeatedly is that DPIs is not a term that's sort of, uniformly recognized. And if I take my own country, if I say DPI, they will not recognize what is DPI. We are still looking at technology, digital infrastructure in a very narrow, through a very narrow lens of looking at the unique identity, and that is our key focus. So from that perspective, I think it is not so much a north-south divide as more a case of we have not even considered what is happening in the north. We're still trying to catch up with what is happening in the region, and especially India having taken the lead. I think we've been fortunate to have sort of access to some of the positive news on that front and try and replicate some of those in our own countries. So that's the first point. And in that context, to me, if we try to sort of look at this in a more global agenda, I think one of the key issues is financing. You know, again, I think this was mentioned, the word public in DPIs is in some sense, you know, it's not problematic, but it's you know, governments are supposed to take the lead on this. But the private sector is equally important in building up on the infrastructure and delivering. Governments are cash straps in the South. Now, the incentive structures are very different. The private sector is going to be looking at ensuring that they have some economic returns, financial returns. They will want to monetize whatever data they collect. They may prioritize products that will meet those business models rather than government priorities of trying to deploy something that is of more of a public good. So in that context, I think countries in the South, and I'm not putting India into that category, but other countries like mine, we are struggling to find financing. And what was mentioned earlier is that we know there are countries out there that are willing to help, not only with the financing, but also with the technical assistance, capacity building, and all the rest of it. So Sri Lanka is a prime example of a country that approached India, asked for its assistance, and India has given that that help. So we are in the process of deploying the unique identity system. Bids were called, but there is a problem. The moment the Indian grant came, and there was a condition in that the suppliers have to be Indian companies, the concerns on the Sri Lankan front was, we are having problem dealing with trust issues with our governments. We have tried to roll out privacy laws, but of course our privacy laws are way behind because we are still not thinking of DPIs as a larger infrastructure ecosystem. So, you know, this is work in progress. Now, if we have a problem with trusting our own governments, now what happens if an Indian company is collecting our data? Where is it being stored? Who is responsible? Is there a cross-border you know, agreement on this? And does our privacy laws account for these new developments? So I think these are problems that India will also, as it takes on the mantle of trying to sort of scale up its engagement on DPIs through the G20 and beyond, will have to kind of, you know, not just India, but all of the other partners about the financing, because in some sense the financing is also related to a key concern of data privacy as well at the end of it. The second, I think, important issue is again on you know, sovereignty of the information. We are, you know, that's where the geopolitics of it also comes. We have still not understood clearly what is it that different leaders in technology are offering the lesser advanced southern countries who are still grappling to understand what is it that the US is offering, freer flow of data, what is China offering? Because some of it is being offered through the BRI initiatives, is more sort of controlled data flow. The EU has, I think, you know, puts individual rights, and India, third way of more sort of, you know, data sovereignty. So I think the discourse on North-South, you know, there's a lot more catching up to do for us. That before we consider this to be a North-South issue, it is more a case of us trying to catch up with our peers in the South itself, and how to build up those relationships and then scale up thereafter.
No, good point made, and thank you for calling out these two issues on financing and the trust part. We will definitely come back to both. I think these are important ones to hear everybody's thoughts on. But before I do that, the North-South issue definitely is visible more on the SDGs front. And case of this is especially for you because UNDP released a report, which I believe was titled Accelerating the SDGs Through Digital Public Infrastructure. And I believe that was first of its kind in terms of a guide for DPI implementation in the context of achieving the SDGs. How can we form potential collaborations here for using the DPI approach in accelerating every country's journey towards achieving those goals? And just to call that out, I don't know how many people saw the report released this year. We are midway in the journey on SDGs, and one thing was very clear, that there's a lot more to be done for us to achieve those goals. So would love to hear the UNDP and your thought process in that.
Suhail, thank you so much. And for those of you who were part of this report, we had great many debates on what is a DPI and what is not a DPI. This, I think, foundational document that for the first time really looked at the role that digital public infrastructure approach can play across the various SDGs was done with the leadership of the India G20 presidency. And in those great many debates, we also saw that the SDGs itself are also not intuitively understood. I mean, what is, life above water and life below water, and how do you really separate digital systems according to these SDGs? So I think it's important to remember that SDGs are our vantage point in terms of really putting people at the center of development, of how we cooperate on development, but certainly not the organizing framework per se, I should say. But let me just take a step back and Suhail, say that this is my third GTS. The first one was, I think, virtual, perhaps, if I remember correctly, because of the end of COVID and so on. But it's really, really extraordinary, as I think my co-panelists have also acknowledged, to see the level of discussion and the different perspectives coming in. And from UNDP side, it's really a privilege to be a knowledge partner of the Global Technology Summit and to come here to bring that country perspective, which is not always very intuitive, which is not always very well organized and well framed for a global conversation, and is messy. But that is where I think when rubber hits the road, where the collaboration that we are all wanting to do together and accelerate is really around generating that impact at the country level. Now, at the UN, and particularly at UNDP, we do development work in about 130 countries that are recipients of development assistance. We are organized as the UN's leading agency on development across thematic areas such as how do you facilitate access to justice, how do you help solve the challenges of climate change, environment, natural resource protection, how do you facilitate social protection, strengthening systems, both from a policy point of view, but also in terms of the last mile engagements and so on. And when we look at these 130 countries, and my specific team has engaged very strongly in 2023 across 50 of them, we know that the digital public infrastructure consideration is not just about implementing a specific system or implementing, say, digital ID or a payment system or a data exchange layer. But really this approach is about, as I was saying, helping achieve the development goals, helping accelerate the achievement of the development goals. And therefore, as we heard yesterday when Pramod and Rahul and Rudy were talking about the DPI service model, DAS, I think what's true for this DPI approach is that as a Lego building block, it has the ability for us to work together at the country level with governments and with local digital ecosystems to talk about, one, how it is organized in terms of its whole of government approach, in terms of its common minimum technology building blocks that need to be in place, in terms of also its governance layer, which is not just about, justice system to social protection system, but across various systems protecting people's privacy, creating robust grievance redressal mechanisms in place, And when we talk about really the implementation of digital public infrastructure at the country level, it's about how do you create that basic level adaptability, sovereignty, and the ability to innovate on top to create this, plus one effect across sectors. And that is really the Sustainable Development Goals vantage point, Suhail. But allow me also, Suhail, to mention that this year, at the heels of India's G20 presidency, we were able to take the messages and the amazing engagement this group of G20 also did with India's leadership with the Global South, also to the General Assembly in September. And there, under the UN Secretary General's leadership, we crafted an agenda in discussion with the countries on until 2030. What are the key sort of building blocks of digital public infrastructure, not the technology building blocks, but the building blocks that need to be in place so that we may ensure an accelerated rate to achieve the SDGs. And some of my co-panelists have already mentioned many of them, including David, who is dialing in from Germany. Financing is critical, and financing not in terms of how one country gives to another country, but how do you make financing much more catalytic so that the rest of the financing that's flowing into the country on health systems, on justice, and so on can actually be adapting to a DPI approach that can accelerate the SDGs. The issue of safeguards. I mean, safeguards is so important for all of us at the UN and for all of you in this room. But unless we marry the technical adoption with this adoption of a safeguards and create that holding space on the ground where civil society is extremely well engaged, not as criticizers, but as constructive partners in the implementation, in the last mile connections, we are not going to see that full-scale adoption of safeguards. And there, I think with the leadership of the UN Tech Envoy, with UNDP and the wider system players, we are really looking at principles, practices, processes as safeguards to really move beyond principles to the practices that happen at the country level. We're also looking at shortening the adoption curve, and this is where I think the discussion that Pramod led yesterday was very helpful. We've also heard from David on the digital public goods approach, making building blocks more discoverable, available, accessible. But to Kevin's point, it's not just enough to create building blocks, right? We need to sort of think about how they are architected, offered with the right kind of technical assistance at the country level. So I think these are some various agenda items that are emerging until 2030 for us at the UN. And this is really, I think, about accelerating the Sustainable Development Goals, about seeing how ID can be used in payment for ecosystem works in the climate change processes, foreseeing how payment systems can be used by women to submit their bail payments as part of a justice flow of action, as we're seeing across countries and so on.
Thank you so much. Many of the points you raised, and along with what Dushni had highlighted as well, my own sense is a lot of this depends on how we are going to partner with each other, how we're going to collaborate, and that brings the next set of questions that I have. But before I do that, I would love to see if we could accommodate at least a couple of questions from the audience. So one request I have for all the panelists is we'll try to restrict our responses on the questions of the next ones. I'm just going to keep it sharp at my end as well. And Sabine, I'll start with you because, now that more of these funders and multilateral institutions have expressed interest in addressing the financing point that Dushni made on terms of the deployment of DPIs, how do you think we can further synergize these efforts to channel the global resources more efficiently from an institutional perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first, I'd say I think it's great that a lot of people, a lot of donors, funders, different organizations are involved. This is a big problem. It's going to require a lot of people working together, a lot of organizations working together. Look, I think the key is just regular communication and coordination, right? There should be, I don't think that there should be any sort of overarching, obviously every organization has their own objectives, their own agenda, their own interests. So, but I think we should all just be trying to communicate and plan as much as we can together, identify where we might be working in the same country, in the same region. Let's make sure we're not duplicating efforts. And so just finding a way to increase that coordination and communication, I think will be beneficial to everyone.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to continue with the same theme and come back to David. So GIZ also has been fostering many of these partnerships with different international institutions to mobilize funds for DPI adoption. In your views, how can we improve coordinated financing efforts for accelerating the DPI deployment in countries as well? Because then the proof also lies in terms of the financing getting created additionally for the other countries.
Incredible, important, and difficult question. I try my best. With the experience of our digital transformation centers worldwide, ideally in each partner country, we would have what could be called a country platform for digital transformation. These are country-led mechanisms that promote cooperation between development partners across all sectors based on shared strategic visions and priorities. If all actors, and we've heard that before, including the private sector and civil society, unite then behind a sector plan that will allow for donors to coordinate their financing by aligning with the government plans. Such country platforms are, of course, also then valuable for what I mentioned before: policy dialogue, joint learning, and good governance. For country platforms and coordinated sustainable financing, again, we think that MDBs with their in-country presence, expertise, and at least large financing should have a leading role to play. In the context of the MDB reform agenda, we already see shareholders like Germany asking for closer cooperation between MDBs. One example that comes to my mind: IDB and World Bank have signed an MOU which may lead to joint programming in digital, and MDBs have committed to increase co-financing in general, which could then lead to country or regional programs in digital that are long-term, bigger, and more impactful. My bottom line here is we need to break with a project by project approach and get towards sector transformation. For this, cooperation between MDBs and other development partners, including through co-financing and pooled financing, will be key. And country, or as I said, even regional platforms to coordinate investments around a shared plan are one way to go. Overall, investments in DPI can be transformational. I think we probably agree all on this. And we will need action-oriented catalysts meanwhile, like co-develop, to fill the existing gap and unblock progress to support. Also, what I said before, the upstream efforts of nonprofits and DPI ecosystems, making investments that unlock the bottlenecks we've heard about in digital public infrastructure deployment, showcasing successes, and then attracting more sustainable funding in DPI.
Thank you. And just on that showcasing of success, Dushni, you and I were chatting earlier about the trade impact in the economics part of it. In your views, what potential impact could a multilateral framework on DPIs have on world trade in terms of governance, development, and sector-specific growth?
I'll keep it brief. I can see the clock ticking off. I think, multilateral trade has been problem area for more than a decade now, and it's got into a point where trade is now a battleground. We are seeing export ban, import restrictions, and that kind of conflicts are going to intensify. I think in the trade arena, the private sector is involved. They will see opportunities, and these have been discussed at length on how customs procedures can be improved, how tax collections can be improved, how the normal red tape can be cut down if you digitize all of these functions. They will get in, and I think it is better at this point to leave it to a national country level or regional level rather than try and scale it up to multilateral sort of acceptance when all these other trade-related conflicts are at its peak, and that this might be the wrong time. But I think that is a private sector will see opportunities and they'll go and do it in areas that they will profit from.
Thank you. And as we look at those opportunities, one challenge that we've always talked about is about inclusion. And Kezam, I'm going to come to you on this one. When UNDP advocates for an inclusive DPI framework, this is a term that I picked, it also raises the issue of gender inequality and rapid digitization of economies. What policies can be implemented to prevent the replication of gender disparities and other traditional forms of discrimination in the context of DPIs?
Great question, Suhail. I think at the global level, there's certainly more opportunity for us to build more evidence and catalyze global sets of action, particularly around women and the intersection of their choices, inclusion, safety as it pertains to population scale systems that will be enabled through a digital public infrastructure approach. And I think some of the foundational research and evidence is starting to now emerge from the India experience. And one of the best things about a DPI approach is when you have evidence and you place it in front of policymakers, the system itself is so adaptable because of the DPI approach that you can, introduce things like UPI Lite in offline environments and so on. But I think at the global level, there's certainly a need to collect more evidence and understand the lived experiences of women. I think the socioeconomic context of women and not replicating that in the access and inclusion and engagement with services for women is very important. And we've seen that in the context of, say, how grievance redressal mechanisms are designed, or how last mile agents, enable cash in, cash out, or when you sort of go to, collect your benefit transfers where you may have to sort of visit a government agency and so on. And that all, I think, translates at the country level. On the broader sort of inclusive digital public infrastructure framework, I mean, firstly, that the G20 recognized governance and inclusion as part of the adopted G20 framework or principles for DPI is an amazing starting point. I think the Secretary General in particular was very happy with our team. And I have to say, you guys haven't seen Sushilji in the negotiation room, but he's, I think, a powerhouse when it comes to, bringing forth what the Prime Minister of India particularly talks about vis-a-vis in India's agenda on DPI, which is inclusion. And many people understand this as exploitation. Of course, any country is going to talk about exploitation, and it's all bilateral relationships, as any country should, whether you are India or Germany and so on. But I think the negotiations was very much around how do you construct and describe DPI to include governance and the ecosystem, which was a community which formed both part of the description, but also in the framework principles. Now we have a responsibility to take it into practice. And I keep coming back to the point that UNDP always makes is that, we have to connect the dots at the country level. We have to put more mainstream that approach at the country level. And there's, I think, much more to be done, and very much looking forward to working with all of our colleagues and partners on this area. Suhail.
Thank you. I'm going to try and wrap this up with the last two questions, and I'm really sorry, I don't think we'll have time for audience questions, but I hope that people are going to leverage the presence of our panelists post the session as well. Most of you are going to be here, so I'll let the audience connect with you there. And now that your great negotiation skills have been talked about, I will move to you. Looking ahead, how does the government of India intend to engage with other governments, international organizations, and philanthropic bodies to secure funding and execute DPI initiatives across the global south?
Thank you, Suhail. I think, as I said earlier, the PM has already announced, and he has also invited other countries to join. I would just reiterate, given the time, this is a different approach, completely different approach, which we have, we all are aware about Gavi model, in which the society kind of model under 501c in US or in some other country. I mean, that was one option available with us here. There was the approach of international organization, I mean, where creating a completely separate IO. We didn't go ahead with that as well. Other option was to go with the UN trust, multi-donor trust fund model, or with the World Bank trust fund model, or with the fifth model. So there were a couple of models already available with us, but we did not go with either of them, keeping in view, our experiences, and also with keeping in view the regulatory issues and implementation challenges which these bodies have as such. So this is a totally different approach wherein, country is making an investment here. This is a called alternative investment fund model. So the country will be making an investment here and they'll be getting the returns on investment based upon the social impact they do or they create in any other countries in the global south LMICs. That's number one. Number two, keeping in view the DPI ethos, this is not a government implemented body. I mean, just to diffuse that mindset, Government of India will not be driving the implementation. This will again be driven by the people from the private sector, just the way the DPI revolution has been done in India by the private sector. We have broadly been providing the broad regulatory red lines, that's it. So here also I think we'll be raising the fund and will be providing the broad strategic directions, and the implementation will be done by the completely private sector. So therefore it's meant to be far more agile and far more, because we all know that, I'm equally being critical of the government as such. We all know the process issues, the procurement issues, how difficult these are to handle in the government as well as in the IOs, both. So we don't want this to be created. So we wanted to try out with a different approach altogether. So that's that's one on the model. This will be as fun, and then it will be definitely holding an entity, holding a company, and definitely, these bodies, a lot of people like you will be on those boards and driving the implementation. That's the intent, that's the idea. And this will be a platform wherein, for us as a country as well, wherein we can implement deploy the DPI implementation, maybe on a bilateral basis, many of you may be knowing that, we have already 8 countries have approached us. We have already signed MOU with 8 countries. I won't be given the time. I won't be naming them. And then we have also signed, there's a joint declaration from 3 countries like EU, France, and US for implementation of a DPI in a 3rd country. And so therefore, this is a platform which will actually operationalize the implementation of a DPI either on a bilateral basis or on a trilateral basis or a multilateral basis. So I hope this experiment would succeed just the way DPI has, and I'm so very happy to see that there's some convergence on the pooled financing here. That's a big takeaway from me from this event, because nobody was against pooled financing, but everybody said that just give it to me, why create a separate body? But this body will be different from the existing ones which we see as of now, and will be keeping in line with the ethos of DPI. So that's how it is. And just one line more, governance. In each of these bodies, government as such does not have major role in it, and the DPI implementation has a very important role for the government, not for the implementation purposes, because governance, as Kizom said, is a very important layer, right? Technology, I think it can be implemented by companies, but how do you create? How do you land in that country? How do you create those governance reforms? It's the government, which have carried out those reforms. They are the best people, not only India, maybe from other countries as well. So they are the best people as to guide other countries, as to how the reforms needs to be carried out. And that's the reason we have this DPI repository as well, which carries experiences from all other countries, 16 countries from as of now, 50 plus DPIs. So therefore, governance and the trust as well. Definitely a country would have far more trust in collaborating and getting a DPI implemented through a government-led multi-stakeholder body than maybe 501c or a Section 8 company in India. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And all that I can say is sounds very exciting. And because GTS is focusing on DPI and AI, I just want to end with a question for you, Kevin, which is, many experts believe that the path to global DPI adoption could be fast-tracked on the back of AI and an inclusive approach. And LLM is a key here. How can AI help in global deployment of DPI and also ensure that it is being deployed sustainably and equitably?
That's quite an overtime question. So I'll try to be quick and narrow. So whatever you're trying to do via DPI, whether it's get a loan, get social assistance, get education, it requires an interaction. And you should be able to have that interaction in the language you prefer, on the device or the in-person interaction that works for you, and at the time of that works for you. And you should be able to get your questions answered and work through your situation. The future of LLMs and applications built on them offers that, but we need it to be relevant to the people that we need to reach and need to be relevant to everyone in their situation. There's a lot of pieces of the puzzle need to come together. Efforts to collect relevant training data, like the Lacuna Fund, which has been propelled by GIZ, Google.org, and a number of other funders, are, I think, the beginnings of that. For the rest of it, since we're out of time, I'll just point you to Nandan Nilekani's presentation yesterday. Look it up, and it's great food for thought for how we get there.
No, absolutely agree on that one. I think people who missed the presentation, I'm sure the Carnegie team will figure out a way to share that as well. But I wanted to summarize the discussion. There are too many good points. I'm going to skip that part and not take away time from the subsequent panelists and speakers. Just want to thank all of you. Really appreciate and also being very candid about what you think. And David, once again, sorry, but I really appreciate you could join at least virtually. And just wanted to wrap this up. Thank you once again. Thanks, everyone.